That busy late afternoon in one of the largest shopping malls in the city, Edward Foster discreetly entered the store that bore the name of his own retail chain. No one there knew who he was. To the employees and customers, he was just another middle-aged man, dressed in simple jeans and a discreet jacket. But Edward was there for a very clear reason: to experience firsthand the reality of his business. As he walked among the meticulously organized shelves, his sharp eyes captured details that a CEO would never see from behind a desk in a luxurious office. The lighting was perfect, the background music created an inviting atmosphere, and the aisles were spotless. To any customer, the experience seemed ideal, but Edward knew that the true soul of a company lay in the people who kept it running. That was when he noticed an uncomfortable scene unfolding near the women's clothing section. "I already told you this rack has to be organized perfectly, Claire. Do you think we're here to play around?" Mark Andrews, the store manager, spoke in a sharp and impatient tone. Claire Nichols, the young employee folding clothes with trembling hands, did not immediately look up. Her face was flushed, her eyes glistening as she fought back tears. I'm reorganizing it, Mr. Andrews," she replied, keeping her voice low but firm. "Not enough." Mark stepped forward, grabbing a few pieces and tossing them back onto the messy pile. "You've been working here for 2 years and still can't do something as simple as this. That's why you'll never get out of this miserable position." The humiliation was public. Customers pretended not to hear, others averted their eyes, uncomfortable, but no one intervened. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. This was unacceptable. He watched as Claire took a deep breath, picked up the scattered clothes, and continued her work, even after being exposed like that. She didn't respond to the manager, didn't complain. She just kept going, as if she were already used to that kind of abuse. Edward could have revealed himself right then and there. He could have said that he was the owner of that store, that mall, and hundreds of other locations across the country. He could have destroyed Mark Andrews in seconds. But something about Claire made him hesitate. He wanted to understand just how deep that toxicity ran. Instead of acting impulsively, Edward decided to wait. He picked up a random shirt, walked to the checkout, and paid for it, discreetly observing the employees in the process. The cashiers were overwhelmed, the attendants rushed, and everyone seemed tense, as if they were walking on eggshells. When he left the store, it wasn't to go home. He simply stepped away far enough to observe more closely, and that was how his investigation began. In the following days, Edward returned several times, always in disguise. Sometimes he pretended to be an undecided customer. Other times, he just strolled through the store, listening to conversations, analyzing expressions, identifying patterns. And what he discovered left him outraged. Mark Andrews wasn't just a demanding manager, he was a tyrant. He publicly humiliated employees, threatened to fire them over minor mistakes, and made sure to assert his power. Worse yet, his influence extended beyond himself. Other supervisors followed his example, making the store's environment unbearable for subordinates. But Claire was different. Despite everything, she never responded rudely. She never disrespected a colleague. And even when Mark ridiculed her, she simply kept her focus on her work, maintaining a dignity that Edward rarely saw in people. He decided he needed to act, but not in the obvious way. If he exposed his identity immediately, Mark would be fired on the spot. But that wouldn't solve the deep-rooted problem in that store. The real test would come if everyone was put to the test without knowing who was evaluating them. Edward needed a plan, and this time, he wasn't just a CEO. He was a man on a mission. The next morning, Edward Foster returned to the store, but this time he wasn't just observing. He was going to infiltrate. Using fake documents prepared by his trusted team, he introduced himself as Edward Wright, a new temporary employee. The overwhelmed HR department processed his hiring quickly. Within hours, he was already wearing the store uniform and receiving basic instructions from an indifferent supervisor. "You'll help with restocking and organizing shelves. Nothing complicated. Don't be late, don't complain, and if the manager talks to you, just say, 'Yes, sir.'" The supervisor's tone was dry. Edward simply nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He wanted to experience firsthand what employees faced daily. On his very first shift, he had his first encounter with Mark Andrews. "You, the new guy," Mark shouted from across the store, drawing attention. Edward stopped immediately. "Your name?" "Edward, sir." "Great. Then listen up, Edward. Here, no one stands around. You're paid to work, not to breathe. If I catch you leaning against a shelf, Consider yourself fired." Edward just nodded. He didn't need to respond. His goal was to study Mark and understand how much his authority influenced the team. And in the following days, he realized that the manager's influence went beyond arrogance and insults. Mark instilled fear. Employees didn't just avoid contradicting him, they avoided each other. There was no sense of teamwork. Everyone was always looking over their shoulder, fearing they would be the next target of his wrath. But Claire still stood out. Even overwhelmed, she helped colleagues whenever she could. If someone couldn't finish a task on time, Claire lent a hand. If she saw a customer needing help and no one stepped forward, she did, and that made her a constant target. "Nichols," Mark's voice echoed once again, drawing everyone's attention. Claire closed her eyes for a brief second before turning to him. "Yes, sir? Do you think this is a charity home? Why are you always helping the incompetents? Do you want them to get paid for sitting on your lap?" Claire took a deep breath. "I was just making sure the customer was helped quickly." Mark stepped closer, stopping inches from her. "If I tell you to ignore a customer, you ignore them. If I tell you to turn your back and let someone fend for themselves, you do it. I'm the one in charge here, got it?" Silence filled the store. Customers watched uncomfortably. Employees lowered their heads. That's when Edward made a decision. He couldn't just keep watching. "Mr. Andrews," he said, his voice firm but controlled. Mark turned abruptly. "What?" With all due respect, what Claire did was right. The customer needed help, and she solved the situation. "Isn't that part of our job?" The entire store seemed to hold its breath. No one had ever spoken to Mark like that. The manager took a step toward Edward, his eyes blazing. "You've been here what? 2 days?" He laughed sarcastically. "And you already think you know how things work?" Edward held his ground. "I don't need to be here for years to know what's right." Mark was silent for a few seconds. Then he smirked. "I like employees who think they have opinions, because they give me the chance to teach them what happens when they talk too much." He turned to Claire. "And you, Nichols? Are you going to defend your new little friend?" She hesitated. Her eyes moved from Mark to Edward. The risk was great. If she defended the new employee, she could suffer even more retaliation. But then, summoning courage from a place deep within herself, she lifted her chin and spoke. "Edward is right." Mark couldn't hide his surprise. "What did you say?" "That he's right," Claire repeated, her voice now steadier. "We're here to help customers. If that weren't the case, the store wouldn't even need employees." Edward noticed how her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She was scared, but she wouldn't back down. Mark leaned in slightly toward her, his voice now low and venomous. "Let's see how far your courage goes when I'm holding your termination papers." He stepped away, casting one last warning look before disappearing down the next aisle. Edward knew this wasn't over, but one thing was certain. Claire was no longer alone, and Mark Andrews had no idea what was coming. That night, Edward Foster left the store with one certainty. Mark Andrews needed to fall, but not in a simple way. He wanted to expose the manager's corruption in a way that would leave a permanent mark. And above all, he wanted to ensure that Claire and the other employees would never be treated that way again. In the following days, Edward intensified his investigation. As an employee, he had direct access to the store's daily operations, and what he discovered was even worse than he had imagined. Mark didn't just humiliate employees. He manipulated performance records, forced unfair dismissals, and, in some cases, diverted high-value merchandise to sell on the side. He was the kind of man who felt untouchable, but he was about to find out he wasn't. The following week, Edward decided it was time to start acting. The first step of the plan was simple. He needed allies, and Claire was the first key piece. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked in a low voice when the two were near the stockroom, away from Mark's watchful eyes. She hesitated. Since the confrontation with the manager, Claire had been in his crosshairs. Her shifts had been doubled, her breaks reduced, and any mistake, no matter how small, was used against her. But something in Edward's gaze made her nod. The two stepped aside to a quiet corner. "What is it?" she asked, still wary. Edward took a deep breath. "I know you don't trust me yet, but I need you to know that I'm not here just to work. I'm here to take Mark down." Claire's eyes widened. "What? You know as well as I do that this place is rotten. And you're not the only one suffering. There are people afraid of losing their jobs, people who work hard and never get recognized while he steps on everyone." Claire crossed her arms, evaluating him. "And what exactly do you plan to do?" Edward measured his words. He couldn't reveal everything yet. "Just help me gather evidence. I need documents, sales records, anything that can prove he's not only a terrible leader, but also involved in something bigger." Claire frowned. "Do you have any idea what kind of risk you're taking?" Edward gave a slight smile. "I do you?" She was silent for a moment, then let out a long sigh. "If it means he'll pay for everything he's done, then I'm in." With Claire by his side, Edward gathered valuable information. She had long suspected that Mark was involved in something shady, but never had the means to prove it. The two began collecting evidence discreetly. Edward used his experience to analyze financial records and found clear discrepancies. High-value items being lost, cash registers that didn't match sales reports, employees being forced to sign questionable documents. Claire, in turn, managed to access conversations between Mark and his direct superiors, where he blatantly lied about employees, ensuring that any complaints against him were ignored. But the final piece of evidence came from an unexpected place. On a busy evening, Edward noticed Mark speaking with a man near the emergency exit. Something about the way the two acted caught his attention. He discreetly moved closer and managed to hear part of the conversation. "5,000 this time. If you want more, you'll have to wait for the next batch." The other man grumbled something inaudible, but Edward understood enough. Mark was involved in a product diversion scheme. Now he just needed proof. That same night, Edward took a risky step. He activated the recorder on his phone and hid the device near Mark's office. It was a dangerous game, but it paid off. The next morning, he retrieved the phone and listened to the recording. "I don't care, just make it disappear from the records. If anyone asks, it was an inventory miscount." That was enough. Now Edward had everything he needed. The next day, Edward arrived at the store earlier than usual. But this time, it wasn't as an employee. Dressed in a flawless suit, he walked through the store with firm steps, drawing the attention of everyone around him. Employees looked surprised, not understanding what was happening. When Mark appeared in the main aisle, his eyes met Edward's and filled with confusion. "What the hell are you wearing?" Edward smiled slightly. "My work clothes, Mark. My real work clothes." The manager narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying?" Edward took a step forward, his voice echoing throughout the store. "I'm saying that I'm Edward Foster, the true owner of this company." The store fell into absolute silence. Claire held her breath. Other employees exchanged shocked glances. Mark laughed, trying to appear calm. "This is a joke, right?" "No, but what I have for you won't make you laugh." Edward pulled out his phone and pressed play. Mark's voice echoed through the store. "I don't care, just make it disappear from the records." The manager's face paled, and then Edward said the words that would seal Mark Andrews' fate. "You're fired, and I hope you have a good lawyer." Claire smiled for the first time in a long while, but this story wasn't over yet. Edward had bigger plans for that store, and Claire, well, she didn't know it yet, but her destiny was about to change forever. Mark Andrews' dismissal was just the beginning. Edward Foster wouldn't be satisfied with simply removing a toxic manager. He wanted something bigger. He wanted to transform that place from a suffocating, oppressive environment into one where employees could work with dignity and respect. But before that, he had to face the storm that was coming. The news of Mark's firing spread like wildfire through the store. Some employees were too stunned to celebrate. After all, that man had terrorized them for years. Others, like Claire, could barely hide their relief, but not everyone reacted well. "This is ridiculous," shouted one of the supervisors loyal to Mark. "Who do you think you are to just walk in here and take down a manager?" Edward crossed his arms, staring at the man. "I'm the owner of this company, and what's ridiculous is what I discovered here. A culture of abuse, neglect, and fear. That ends today." The supervisor scoffed, but didn't dare respond. It was Claire who broke the tense silence. You're really the owner?" Her voice was hesitant, as if she still couldn't fully believe it. Edward turned to her and nodded. "I am, Claire, and I saw everything that happened to you. I saw how Mark treated you. I saw how you kept working with integrity even when no one else seemed to care." She lowered her eyes for a moment, processing everything. Then she took a deep breath and looked up. "What happens now?" Edward smiled slightly. Now we fix this place." The first thing Edward did was call a meeting with all employees, not just the supervisors or team leaders, everyone, cashiers, stock clerks, sales associates. It was something unprecedented in that store. When everyone was gathered in the cramped break room, Edward stood before them. I know many of you still don't understand what's happening. I know some of you may be skeptical, but let me make one thing clear. This company has always been about the people, about you, and I failed to ensure that was the case here. A murmur spread among the employees. They were used to being ignored. No one from upper management had ever spoken to them like this before. That ends today. From now on, this store will no longer be a place of fear and exploitation, and I want to start by listening to you. The silence was broken by a hesitant voice. You're really going to listen to us? It was a stockroom employee, an older man who had clearly endured years of mistreatment in that place. Edward looked directly at him. Yes, and not just listen. I'm going to act. In the following days, Edward implemented immediate changes. Supervisors who had enabled Mark's behavior were fired. Employees who had been unfairly dismissed in recent months were called back. A new anonymous reporting system was created to ensure that no one would suffer abuse without having a way to defend themselves. But the biggest surprise came when Edward announced a new leadership position. We need someone who truly understands the daily challenges of the team, someone who knows this store inside and out, someone who has proven their integrity. The employees fell silent, waiting for the name. Then, Edward turned to Claire. And that person is you. Claire's eyes widened. What? I want you to be the new manager of this store. The break room erupted in murmurs. No one had expected that. Claire stared at him, stunned. But I don't have experience. You have everything you need, Claire, Edward responded with conviction. You know how this store works. You care about people. You were already a leader here, even without the title. She looked around, seeing the faces of her co-workers. Some seemed surprised, others clearly approved of the decision. Edward took a step forward. If you want it, the job is yours. Claire took a deep breath. I accept. The break room erupted in applause. For the first time in years, that place had hope. In the following months, the store underwent a transformation. Employees started smiling again. The atmosphere became lighter. Sales even increased because customers could feel the difference in service. And Claire proved to be the leader Edward always knew she could be. One night after closing the store, Edward and Claire stayed behind. I never thought my life would change like this, she said, looking at the mall lights outside. Edward smiled. You deserved this, Claire. From the very beginning. She turned to him. But what about you? Why did you do all this? Edward was silent for a moment. Because success means nothing if we don't take care of people. Claire smiled. You're not the kind of CEO I imagined. Edward laughed. And you're not the kind of manager I imagined. They laughed together, knowing that this story wasn't just about a store or a job. It was about people, about dignity, and about the power of doing the right thing no matter the cost. And for Edward and Claire, this was only the beginning. The months that followed solidified the changes Edward had started. The store, once a toxic environment, became a model for all other locations in the company. Claire's leadership inspired employees, and her commitment to a fair and respectful workplace was reflected in the store's performance. Sales soared, customers returned frequently, and even the corporate office took notice of the transformation. But Edward knew his mission wasn't over yet. One morning, while reviewing reports in his office at the company's headquarters, he received an unexpected email. Subject: Organizational Culture Report. Issues in other locations. It was a lengthy document with anonymous testimonies from employees in various stores across the network. What he had witnessed at Claire's store wasn't an isolated case. The problem was widespread throughout the country. The change needed to be bigger. That same night, Edward visited the store where it had all begun. He wanted to talk to Claire because he knew she would understand the importance of what was coming next. He found her in the office reviewing spreadsheets and analyzing the team's performance. It was impressive to see how much she had grown in such a short time. Still working? Edward asked, leaning against the door. Claire looked up and smiled. Just making sure everything's in order. He walked in and sat across from her. I need your help, Claire. She furrowed her brows, curious. What is it? Edward pulled out his phone and opened the report he had received. What happened here wasn't an isolated case. There are other stores with managers like Mark, places where employees still live in fear, without recognition, without respect. Claire's eyes filled with concern. It means the problem is bigger than we thought, Edward interrupted, and I can't fix it alone. She looked at him for a few seconds before asking, "What do you have in mind?" He smiled slightly. "I want you to help me change the entire culture of this company.